This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I need a caffeine boost. I got 2 of those energy shot coffee drinks in the fridge right now and trying to figure out when the best time to have one is. They're pretty hefty cans. And I've never had one before, so I don't know how it's going to affect me, especially late in the evening. Right now I got water. It's probably all I can handle at the moment. Coffee already gives me the runs as it is. I don't even want to think about what'll happen if you add sugar and all the other artificial ingredients. Luckily, I'm just here to record the WCW recap, so it shouldn't be that long. I'll do Midsouth and World Class tomorrow and Tuesday. The days of trying to cram in all 3 reviews in one sitting are long gone. Not anymore. So I'll jump into the intros here and get that out of the way so we can get into the Superstation recap. Folks, you are tuned into the 5 Starr Wrestling Report, the wrestling channel nobody knows but everyone needs. Here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for classic wrestling talk. I literally just did one of these earlier when I recorded the Raw review, so it's like I'm regurgitating the same promo again. I guess these intros have become kind of status quo, haven't they? I've tried to spice it up here and there, but generally I just kind of sit down and start recording, hoping that something will come to mind as I'm talking, but most of the time I got nothing. I promise you my life is not that boring. But you know how it goes. When the red light's on, so is the pressure. I've also got people texting me right now, so I'm partially distracted. But whatever. I'm going to ignore all that and try to zone in here so we can get into this report without any hiccups. So we have 2 more weeks before the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view. I think the WWE Vault channel just uploaded the full pay-per-view on a playlist somewhere. So I might not even have to stream it on Peacock. I might be able to just watch it on YouTube if I can remember which Vault channel it is. That is the one added benefit to them leaving a lot of these streaming platforms. I mean, all that classic footage is going to migrate to YouTube in some capacity. Not all the classic footage, mind you, but a good chunk of it. It's hard to say if that'll be the case when they leave Peacock next year. I mean, at this point, I pretty much have access to everything I need on either YouTube or, I guess, Dailymotion. The only obstacle I know I'm going to run into is when we have to do the WCW pay-per-view recaps. Or the Clash of Champions. But that's a bridge we'll have to cross in a few months. So, what was I talking about? Oh, that's right. Halloween Havoc. Yeah, we're still building to that on the Superstation. We finally have a general idea of what's supposed to be happening in this Thunderdome Cage match. Meaning that they finally bothered to explain what the stipulations and rules are. That was sort of a missing piece to the pie in the recent weeks. We'll cover that segment in a bit, but first we have to recap the TV opener of Lee Scott and Bill Ford versus the Dynamic Dudes. There was an interesting thing I noticed when the dudes were making their entrance here. This isn't a newfound concept, but there's a pattern that's been developing when Shane and Johnny are coming down for the ring entrances. Normally they'll grab a kid in the front row and pull him over the guardrail to do their little babyface shtick. And it's always hilarious to me because it never ceases to fail. They'll try to have some wacky interaction with a kid, and the kid will be totally confused. Like he has no idea how to react to Shane or Johnny. The thing with the dudes is everybody, including kids, hate them because they're the most unlikable douchebag babyfaces of all time. And these ring entrances prove my point. Every time. You can tell that Cornette's working closely with these two to try to give them pointers, especially when it comes to double team offense. The problem is that when you take into account Johnny Ace's offense, outside anything he and Shane did as a combo move, I'm convinced that Johnny's entire offensive moveset consisted of two things: an arm drag takeover and an RKO. Shitty RKO at that. Shane could at least do some stuff. Johnny Ace, that guy didn't even have 5 moves of doom. Fucking Kevin Nash had him beat in terms of in-ring offense. How sad. I'm not even kidding you. Go watch the match if you don't believe me. Every single offensive move from Johnny in this match was an arm drag takeover. That was all he did. They also nearly botched the finish where Johnny had Ford up in a vertical suplex position, and as Shane was coming off the top of the crossbody, Johnny nearly dropped Ford right on top of his head with a brain buster. And I know that was not the planned move. It's one of those things where I could take the cop-out approach and say, I'm sure he was a nice guy, but then I'm reminded, when you're talking about a repugnant piece of shit like John Laurinaitis, you can't even do that. Not only was he a human scumbag, but he also sucked dick as a pro wrestler. That is a bad twofer. It's one thing to be a horrible professional wrestler. Can't even defend the guy by saying he had a good heart. Now, Norman the Lunatic, on the other hand, that's somebody we can say, man, he was a very bad pro wrestler, but he was a nice guy. He also had the unfortunate Raw deal of having to pretend to be somebody that broke free from a loony bin. That did not help. I'm actually very surprised that they kept that gimmick around after Flair took the book. I would have figured Flair would have been the first to put his foot down and say, no, we're not putting this garbage on television anymore. Or maybe he did try to put his foot down, but Jim Herd put the kibosh on it. Who knows? All I know is that he and Ricky Nelson had a really crappy match for a few minutes, and Norman went over after he dropped his ass on top of Nelson's face and shoulders. We also had Luger showing up at the commentary booth to try to force the truck to play the footage of what happened between him and Pillman last week. But then Cornette and JR were like, "We can't, Lex. We have to go to break." So, of course, they just wind up playing the footage about 15 minutes later. I found that quite amusing. So then we came back for Chris Powers versus Tommy Rich. Dear God in heaven. This is where I wrote in my notes, "Tell me you're phoning in this taping block without telling me you're phoning in this taping block." I know it was only a 45-minute show this week, but Jesus Christ. 3 matches in a row. And so far we've seen a dynamic dude squash that nearly put me to sleep. A Norman the Lunatic squash that made me question my sanity. And now they're about to make me sit through a Tommy Wildfire Rich match. And I figured they were going to go a while. Boy, did they. For a good solid 7.5 minutes. Every goddamn bit of it. There was a point here where Ross and Cornette got so bored calling the action, JR started talking about how he knew nearly every takeout number by heart. Meaning that he ordered a lot of takeout food, so he knew almost all the fast food chains without having to use a phone book. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the part where Cornette brought up how people might know a good deal about Tommy Rich from the late 70s. But what the fans should really be talking about right now is Tommy Rich here in 1989. To which I simply asked, "What about him, Jim?" He wrestles boring 10-minute TV matches and nearly puts the audience into a coma every time he's out there. He's like Brad Armstrong, but without the good genetics. Seriously, dude. I know Tommy Rich was a big star in his heyday. I've acknowledged that during these TBS reviews. But we are in 1989. Closing in on 1990. The days of Wildfire Tommy Rich ever being viewed as a top territorial babyface, that is long gone. We are very much beyond that point. They've got Sting, Luger, Flair, Funk, the Steiners, the Midnight Express, the Road Warriors, just to name a few. Guys like Pillman coming up the ranks. Nobody was ever asking for a Wildfire Tommy Rich comeback run in the late 80s. I promise you that. God bless him. But his time came and went. Speaking of Flair and Sting, they had a pre-tape promo where, they kind of sort of explained what the hell the rules were to this electrified Thunderdome Cage match. When I look back and actually see how they explain how it came together, I think I now understand why they didn't try this concept again after this year. They just left it to the idiot marks like Dixie Carter and Vince Russo to try and rip it off 20 years later in TNA. Oh, and it failed. Epically. I still was not clear on what the rules were to this match after they cut this promo. To be honest, I'm not even entirely sure they knew what the fucking rules were. That's why they sounded so vague. First, Sting talked about their designated Terminator, aka the corner man who was primarily responsible for throwing in the towel for his team, should one of them try to submit. By the way, sidebar, that's also an important detail to mention. They only now, approximately 2 weeks before the pay-per-view, they let us know who the opponents were in this match. It's Sting and Flair versus Muta and Funk. I don't think they ever mentioned that prior to the show. They announced a gimmick cage match, never before seen in the US, and they waited until 2 weeks before the actual show to let everybody know who was going to be wrestling in it. Why? Well, it's still WCW. Yes, the booking was a lot better, but they were totally clueless as an organization when it came to marketing and or advertising. In all fairness, it still wasn't as tacky as the dreaded Chamber of Horrors match that they booked at Halloween Havoc 91. But it was still a rotten gimmick concept. Now, when it comes to their designated Terminator, I'd actually completely forgotten about this until Flair name-dropped him here. I remember that he came back toward the tail end of '89 to take an office job. I just failed to recall that he was a vital part to the Thunderdome Cage match. And I'm obviously talking about Ole Anderson, which, kind of brings me to a conversation we need to have about the initial plan for the return of the Horsemen. I still think we're about a month or so out from that whole botched experiment, so I won't go into a massive tirade about the failed returns of Arn and Tully yet. Oh, don't worry, it's coming. I've got a thing or two to say about that debacle. But yeah, they brought back Ole here to be the corner man for Sting and Flair. Meanwhile, in the opposite corner, you had Gary Hart serving as the corner man for Muta and Funk. And so, in walks Ole. It is our first time technically seeing Ole Anderson back in the NWA since, well, 87, I think, right? He was kicked out of the Horsemen in favor of Luger. He stuck around for a little bit doing some mid-card work as a babyface. I think if I remember right, they tried to do a makeshift babyface tag team with him and Tim Horner that went basically nowhere. And then Ole retired shortly thereafter. So now he's back in the picture in sort of a manager/mentor role. And he simply came out here to tell Gary Hart that his team is in for the fight of their lives in Philly. There was no quit in Flair or Sting's vocabulary. Just a good old-fashioned butt-whooping Horseman style. It was a great promo. Not taking anything away from it. I certainly miss those old classic Horseman promos we used to get on the Superstation with Flair, Ole, Arn, and Tully. Just makes me angry when I see what they're trying to clearly set up toward the end of the year. But then everything went to shit because Jim Herd went back on his word. And it also didn't help that Tully failed a drug test. Again, though, conversation for a different date. So here was the point where they replayed the altercation between Pillman and Luger from the other week. And I know we briefly touched on the whole short-lived feud these two had over the US heavyweight title. I'm still of the opinion they could have milked that program for a lot longer than 2 months. Especially considering how hot Pillman was by this point. Again though, plans change pretty rapidly between now and February of next year. So we eventually get Pillman taking on Joe Kazana. Now here's an example of a babyface interacting with some kids and them actually looking genuinely excited to see him. As opposed to Johnny and Shane where they all look like hostage victims. So they're out there having a standard TV match for a few minutes. And Luger wound up returning to try to teach Pillman a lesson. Because he's still embarrassed after having been punked out twice last week. So he hits the ring and immediately tries to take out Pillman, who also winds up taking out Kazana because he was accidentally standing in the line of fire. That was funny. And as they're slugging it out here and having a bar fight at ringside, crowd is literally soiling themselves seeing these two beat the shit out of one another. And they did a great job making everything look legit. And it goes back to what we talked about where guys used to lay stuff in back in the day and make everything look as real as possible. Before everyone started doing the windmill punches and the walk fighting bullshit. So this is all fantastic. And you know, I gotta say, considering all the other programs happening during this time, man, as much as people remember the Funk Flair stuff for being awesome, myself included, I would make an argument that people are more invested right now in Luger versus Pillman. And this is a real personal heated rivalry that picked up a lot of steam pretty much within the last 2 or 3 weeks. It was a drastic pickup. I mean, all it took was Pillman coming out on TV and calling out Luger for his BS. Now the people really want to see these two rip each other in half. Didn't take much. But they've got the people hooked with this feud. I would definitely call it an underappreciated feud when you look at the scope of everything happening during the fall of '89. And again, I think that's primarily because of how short the feud lasted. I mean, if they gave this thing another 3 to 4 months to really build and really escalate, we might have been talking about a potential feud of the year candidate. So, of course, we go from that to this absolutely dismal white meat cornball babyface promo from Tom Zank. God, literally the definition of an I'm just happy to be here promo. Without any of the vigor or charm that makes a white meat babyface tick. He plugged a pay-per-view match between himself and Mike Rotunda. Said he's looking forward to all his future opportunities in the NWA. Then he smiled at the camera and looked very plain. Literally all there is to say about it. Then, of course, Zank went out there to wrestle Keith Steinborn in a hideously boring squash match. It really is a shame that the Z-Man never clicked. Because when you remove the bland personality aspect, the guy was a considerably good athlete with a really solid look. If you could have just figured out the personality, I think Tom Zank could have actually been somebody in the early to mid-90s. But it's like Vince used to say, he was all sizzle without the steak. I also still can't get over the fact that Zank could actually do some impressive athletic shit in the ring. But his finisher is a fucking sleeper hold of all things. I mean, it is literally the equivalent to somebody that can do a shooting star and a moonsault press flawlessly. But then their finishing move is something like a standard drop kick. Actually, not even that. Something even less impressive, like a front power slam. Could you imagine? I still would like to know who thought him using a sleeper as a finish was a good call. Speaking of me questioning decisions, I'd also like to know who thought it would be a good idea to devote a full interview segment to, of all people, Gene Ligon. You heard that right. The same Gene Ligon that got to wrestle Ric Flair on the Superstation a week or two back. He has apparently been kissing a lot of ass in the office, because they're really giving Gene Ligon some attention on these recent taping blocks. Now let me back up for a minute, because they did provide some context. It's not like they didn't have some sort of plan here. And I looked this up just to be sure, and this was factual. They were not working the people. Gene Ligon was a legit survivor of Hurricane Hugo when that struck Salisbury, North Carolina. And, well, you would think this would be an opportunity for Jim Ross to maybe ask him a little bit about the hurricane, have Gene talk about his personal life and what it was like to be a part of that chaos. Maybe have him talk about how he saved a couple dogs along the way. No. Instead, he proceeded to ask Gene how much he's looking forward to Halloween Havoc, to which Gene answered by saying that he'll be looking forward to the pay-per-view from the comfort of his own home in Salisbury. Yes, he will not be an actual part of the pay-per-view because he's a geek, but he will be able to order the pay-per-view from home like all the other jabroni fans. Then he started talking about football teams and how he became a Cincinnati Bengals fan. And it was at that point where Luger interrupted and sucker punched Ligon and left him laying like an absolute dork. Emphasis on dork. I am not making any of that up. That is a thing that happened this week. They told their audience that one of their wrestlers was a hero for surviving a deadly hurricane. And so they played that up by having him do a shitty 90-second promo where he bumbled over himself. And then he got his ass laid out by the U.S. champion in 5 seconds. What a hero. Maybe Ligon wasn't kissing rear in the office. Maybe he actually pissed somebody off. Because this was quite the fucking burial treatment. I actually kind of felt pity for the guy. What a horrible way to treat your supposed hurricane survivor. Then they wrapped everything up with a 2-minute video package with Woman and Rick Steiner. It was actually videotape of when she was still Robin Green. They sort of streamlined the whole story of her going from Robin to Woman. The whole thing with her and Rick. They showed video of them hanging out at the zoo. The infamous dinner scene where Rick went to meet Woman in the hotel room and realized that she's not the nerdy girl next door, that she's actually a smoke show. All in a way for them to reveal that she was secretly lying about her identity the whole time. And now she has another team that she'll be managing at Halloween Havoc when they take on the Steiners. Now they are still being billed as a mystery tag team, but she has been name-dropping the word Doom in most of her promos. And we obviously remember who Doom wound up being. All in all, it was a fine hype package. It did abruptly cut off at the end, so whoever taped this episode didn't actually record the last few minutes of the program. Not a big deal, I guess. Not a particularly great episode, all things considered. There was a ton of filler and really bland TV squashes this week. But in terms of where we're at 2 weeks before the big pay-per-view, we at least know the core of what's happening on the Halloween Havoc show. The main draw is obviously the Thunderdome Cage, but I'm telling you, man, they could have main evented that show with Luger and Pillman, and I don't think anybody would have been offended. That program is white hot right now. It's funny, you got all these bells and whistles surrounding this Thunderdome electrified cage dealia, Bob. An electrified cage with 2 outside cornermen. And a guest ref. Which I don't even think I mentioned. I mean, fuck, they were so passive about it. They made it seem like it was just another trivial gimmick to the match. Yeah, Bruno Sammartino made a cameo appearance for this thing. In Philly. Which is obviously a big market he drew in during his career. But when you take into account all of that, it still doesn't match the level of excitement that is Pillman versus Luger in a straight singles match for the U.S. title. It's amazing. Still got one more show to review before we do the big pay-per-view recap in a couple weeks. Hopefully they'll spend a little bit of time trying to hard sell the Thunderdome Cage next week. Getting Ole back on TV was a good first start, but it's still missing that icing on the cake. You know, the subject of icing on the cake, it's always a fun time when you get to watch the opening highlight reel for Midsouth TV and they show the footage of Jim Cornette getting his face thrown in the cake. Absolutely timeless. Just as timeless as watching Adrian Street make out with Terry Taylor to steal the TV title. It's always the goofy moments you remember. Meanwhile, I'm the old stick in the mud fan that liked everything better when wrestling was taken seriously. If you missed last week's review, you'll want to go here for the sole purpose of us covering that television title match. It is certainly a classic moment. That was one of the major stories coming out of last week's taping. And another one of those stories bled over into this week. We know Jim Cornette's been making idle threats to Bill Watts in the Midsouth promotion that if he didn't receive a public apology and his $30,000 check back, then he, Bobby, and Dennis would be leaving Midsouth with the belts. Remember that $30,000 fine came when the Midnights attacked the Fantastics during that contract signing a month or so back. So Watts is in the ring with JR to kickstart the show, and he basically gives Jim Cornette his response. And we kind of talked about some potential circumstances where Watts could leverage his authority on Cornette by telling him, hey, your team lost a non-title match to Brickhouse Brown and Master G. Therefore, those two are earned a tag team title shot as a result. That was one option. Or a better one, if you leave Mid-South with the belts, we'll just strip you of the championships and award a new set of champions. Simple as that. All these potential creative options they could have gone with. Well, they took it a step further. Turns out none of that was necessary. As a matter of fact, we now have new tag team champions And that team is none other than the Rock and Roll Express. The returning Rock and Roll Express. So things worked out in the end for Midsouth. The Fine stayed intact. And the Midnights lost the belts. How about them apples? Good does prevail over evil after all. Now, at that point, we didn't exactly know how Ricky and Robert obtained the belts. Yes, duh, they obviously beat Bobby and Dennis to win them. But in terms of the when, how, and where component, that was not mentioned until Joel explained the turnover in New Orleans. Now, we knew the Rock and Roll were slated to make their return. We just didn't know when they would be coming back. Well, not only did they come back, but they scored an upset victory over the champions, and they won the belts. First night back. Corny's been so focused on dealing with the likes of the Fantastics and most recently Brickhouse Brown and Master G, he forgot all about the Rock and Roll Express. So they had a successful return to TV this week. Here's a knocked off Terry Ellis and Bob Owens in a couple minutes, getting the win with their signature double drop kick. Also reclaiming their position as the number one babyfaces in Mid-South. It is quite amazing to go back and see just how popular Ricky and Robert were at one point in time. Man, were they over. Not just over, dare I say, fucking over. Trust me, there's a difference. Staying on the topic of New Orleans, we also had some development in the feud between Master G and Butch Reed. They had a ghetto street fight, which Master G won. But there was more to the story. As we were watching the closing minutes of the two throwing soup bones back and forth, you see Butch going for a pile driver on Master G, but can't get him up in position. So Master G comes down on Reed and throws a few more punches to the head before getting the W. And before he can celebrate, Reed jumps him from behind and tries to get some heat back on himself. But as he goes up for the big knee drop, Master G rolls out of the way and takes advantage of the leg injury by getting Reed locked in what he is now calling the Master Lock. His leg grapevine move that I could have sworn was a calf crusher the other week. It's more like a rolling hyperextension of the guy's thighs. The point is, it hurts. So we get that footage. Then we pitch back to the ring for a Butch Reed interview with JR. Naturally, Butch is unhappy about the whole scenario. Actually, unhappy is underselling it. He is pissed off. We were informed that he went to see an orthopedic surgeon after he sustained that leg injury. So that led to his pre-tape where you see Butch cooped up in a hospital bed trying to do the "oh, woe is me" sympathy heel promo. Talking about how he'll get the last laugh. He's going to recover, get in better shape, and he'll come back to get even for what Master G did to him. That was generally the promo in a nutshell. The audio quality was fucking terrible. Whole thing just sounded like so he literally cupped his hand over the mic the whole way through the promo. His interview with JR was 1,000 times better, because boy was he fired up. God, he was fucking jacked. I'm telling you, man, muscle shirts are every man's wet dream. When you wear a shirt that's tapered to match your body type, You can look like the Incredible Hulk. And the fucking arms on Hacksaw Reed. He was not joking when he told Master G that he's back in the gym training harder than ever. I believed him. His biceps were bigger than JR's head. Said Master G better look out, because when he gets healthy, he's going to be all up in G's face. Great stuff, man. And for the record, I know it was supposed to be a heel promo. I don't care. Butch Reed was epically awesome in this segment. Way too cool for me to hate. So they led us back to the ring after commercial for Master G taking on the debuting Jake Roberts. Not career debut, Midsouth debut. His first run in the area before he made his return in '85 and had a more consistent stay in the territory. Loose air quotes around consistent. Meaning that he was around for a little more than 2 months. This was also, I think, right around the same time Jake had started making appearances in Dallas too. Actually, no, he would have just wrapped up his work in Dallas. Yeah, because he came in and worked a pretty big program with the Von Erichs in '84. Teamed up with Gino and Chris at one point to go after the 6-man belts. I remember Jake was a big part of that. And he was already making big impressions with gaining more TV exposure. Getting over his sinister personality and molding himself into the Jake the Snake character we came to know him for. It's no wonder he got signed to the WWF by '86. Now, of course, he was out there to do the job to Master G. He was on Watts' radar, but he hadn't brought Jake in full time to give him the push he would give him later in '85. But like, even when you go back and see some of the earlier Jake footage, even as a simple underneath enhancement guy, you just knew he was going to be something. He had the look, the ring presence, everything that made you think, give him a few years and Vince is going to snatch him right up. Lo and behold, the prophecy came true. From there, we had a North American title match between Magnum TA and Killer Khan. We also had the return of Skandar Akbar to the Mid-South area. Another group of guys that were recently working in Dallas, and I can't even remember what the situation was with Akbar and Killer Khan. It was probably the same deal with Jake, where they finished up their dates with World Class and then hopped over to work in Mid-South for a bit. Of course, the minute I saw Killer Khan, I started groaning. Had some mild PTSD flashbacks to his run in World Class, where he was out there stinking up the joint every week with terrible main event matches. Thankfully, this was not as monotonous as a lot of those World Class matches were. We actually had Magnum getting on the mic beforehand and cutting a promo on Ernie Ladd. Apparently, Ernie got a hold of Magnum's phone number and started calling his house, spreading rumors that Magnum's been trying to keep the black man down, that Magnum's disrespecting all the black athletes in the Mid-South area because he's one of them white nationalists or whatever. Well, no, turns out Ernie's just being Ernie. A disgruntled ring vet that can't handle the pressure of Father Time catching up to him. So Magnum tells him to piss off and stop calling his home. Now, I mentioned that the match was far less tedious than what we were used to seeing from Killer Khan in World Class. Up until the closing minute or two, it was Still not a particularly great match. It was Magnum taking the brunt of the beating while Khan did a bunch of Mongolian chops and stomps, which is pretty much what he did in all of his Dallas matches, and that's why they suck for the most part, because that's all he ever did. But he eventually puts the Oriental Spike on Magnum. Magnum powers out of it and manages to catch Khan with a belly-to-belly. But in the process, he ends up taking out Carl Fergie by mistake. So while he's down selling, Magnum grabs a hold of Skandar Akbar and catapults him over the top rope into the ring. And right as Magnum traps Akbar in the corner, Khan attacks him from behind. While the heels are double-teaming him, Fergie catches all of them and rings the bell to sound the disqualification. Probably one of the more painless things I've seen involving Killer Khan. But it was still a Killer Khan match. I had almost completely forgotten that Ernie and Magnum were still beefing over the North American title. When Magnum brought up Ernie in that promo, I reminded myself that Ernie was supposed to wrestle Magnum on TV for the title like 2 months ago. And they just never did the match. In fact, the story was Ernie was pissed off that Watts didn't book the match to go on first. So Ernie no-showed and forfeited. And they completely put all of that on hiatus ever since. So, apparently the feud is still going on. Wouldn't you know it? Wouldn't be the first time they dragged something on for months to the point where I forgot it existed. So then we had the Pillsbury Doughboy himself, Jack Victory, going up against Hacksaw Duggan. God, more world-class turnovers. Actually, that's not true. This would have been the inverse effect. Victory didn't actually go to Dallas until 85. I could tell because he was in absolutely wretched ring shape here compared to when he showed up in World Class and looked at least somewhat like an athlete. But that's not really the important part to all this. As fun as it is to rag on Jack Victory, Lord knows I've been doing that consistently on this channel for a couple years now. So Duggan comes out with a small duffel bag, and what he's carrying is what he coins a little bit of a personality change. Something that takes him back to his roots. This is where he reveals his old college football helmet. You've had Dr. Death Steve Williams show up and claim that he's big, bad, and tough. He's been throwing out challenges to the likes of Terry Taylor and Magnum TA, saying that he's the toughest athlete in Midsouth. And until somebody can come out and beat him for a signature helmet, he'll continue to maintain the position that he's the toughest and the baddest in the area. Well, Duggan's got a football helmet of his own. And it gives you a whole different perspective when you channel something through the lens of a cage. Great line, by the way. So he puts his football helmet over in the corner, calls out Williams to come try and take it. And I gotta say, it was certainly a hell of a promo from Hacksaw. He was really fired up here. I almost forgot about the Dr. Death Open challenges. Like again, man, same conversation we just had about the Ernie Ladd Magnum TA feud. They started something with that like 3 or 4 weeks ago and just kind of dissipated. I kind of thought they dropped it when Dr. Death stopped mentioning the helmet. But they're bringing it back up. So Duggan comes out, wipes the floor with Victory in a couple minutes, gets the win with a spear tackle. And, well, we did not get a Dr. Death appearance, but they are definitely setting things in motion for that program. And that brought us to everything surrounding the Adrian Street-Terry Taylor fallout from last week. An incredibly epic moment here at the commentary position with Boyd, Pierce, and Street. Not only is Boyd stunned at what we witnessed last week, he's also disgusted at the manner in which Street stole the TV title from Taylor. The idea of kissing a title away from another athlete, it is both unprofessional and degrading, according to Boyd. So Adrian creepily puts his hand on Boyd's shoulder, starts to make some very suggestive comments about it. And right as Boyd interrupts and pitches to the tape, we get this awesome dialogue exchange where Boyd goes, "Let's go to the tape to see the footage. I'm excited." To which Adrian responds, point blank, "So am I." Fucking died. The timing of Adrian's response there was perfect. I'm excited. So am I. Easy there, boy. So we do in fact get to relive the epic footage of Adrian Street kissing Terry Taylor and then pinning him via roll-up to steal the TV title. Still get a kick out of hearing JR and Joel call that on commentary. Especially Joel. The fact that he's flummoxed over the idea of two dudes making out. It gets me every time. I never watch this footage and not laugh. It's like a contagious disease. And of course, that led to Terry's match this week with Dale Veazey. Adrian stayed on commentary to take some more jabs at Terry being the ex-TV champion. He claimed that Dale had a better physique than Terry, which was hilarious. The whole thing was Adrian making backhanded comments. Anytime Terry would execute a move, Adrian would just chime in with, "Yeah, well, you couldn't do that to me." And he was so passive-aggressive about it. It was a perfect commentary to help continue the tension between the two, adding to the effect of Adrian getting under Terry's skin and trying to stay one step ahead with the mind games. It was all great. The match was nothing, but Adrian's commentary made it worthwhile. Then we had a few minutes of leftover airtime for Jim Horton and Chris Adams versus the Midnight Express. Chris got a massive fucking pop for his ring intro, too. And they mentioned he'd be wrestling Adrian Street for the television title next week. So it was definitely a good warm-up for him. Let him go in there and work with beautiful Bobby. That'll certainly prepare him for a wrestling clinic. So Bobby worked his magic in there for a little bit. There was a phenomenal moment between Adams and Condrey that I watched back like 17 times in a row. The greatest selling job for a super kick I think I've ever seen. Adams catches Condrey with the toe of his boot. Condrey goes flying back toward the corner with his arms spread eagle. And I swear to God, the airtime he got in that before he actually took a bump, I thought he was levitating. It was amazing the way he sold that fucking super kick. Unreal. And it's also one of those beautifully executed matches where Adams is the one dominating everything for his team. And then as soon as Horton tags in, the Midnights immediately take over and start working him over. Because Jim Horton's a nobody in the grand scheme of things. He was simply there to be the fall guy. So eventually the Midnights isolate Horton in their corner and get the win with the divorce court. And, well, we also had Dr. Death come out to do a promo where he called out Duggan's challenge from earlier. Definitely throwing out a lot of stuff in terms of heating up feuds and programs. And it was weird, too, because they really didn't have a big angle or a mass beatdown segment this week. A lot of the segments were just very crisp and concise promos where babyfaces and heels are calling each other out and making their intentions clear. It all worked tremendously well. You know, we keep talking about it, but there's definitely been an uptick with Midsouth television recently. Things are getting progressively better now that the summer lull period is over. A lot of new, fresh programs are starting to heat up here in the fall. And generally, I would just say the shows are a lot livelier. There's more going on. Things don't seem so milquetoast or slow-moving. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this taping block. Didn't really have an epic blowaway segment like we did last week, but good story progression. We're getting to the end of this shindig. Yes, I just used the word shindig in 2025. I legitimately did not know that was a word until I got to like freshman year of high school. I always thought it was one of those slang terms people use. Kind of like how everybody used to call the bathroom the John. That's what I thought shindig was. By the way, I also noticed that my dates got off with the World Class series. So this is actually the October 18th episode, not the 17th. I was thinking about trying to fix the other 2 weeks, but it's probably not even worth it at this point. It's not like it makes a difference in the grand scheme of things. It's all taped anyway. So what we had this week was our first collection of matches that they taped for the annual Cotton Bowl event. And I think it's important to mention this right out of the gate because it is a reflection on the period of world class we're talking about. This is the third annual Cotton Bowl that they ran at Texas Stadium in Dallas. And when you go back and look at the first two events from 84 and 85, the attendance figures are very telling. Get a load of this. In 1984, October 27th, the attendance/gate number listed, 12,000. Fast forward a year later, October 6th, when they actually ran it earlier in the month, they drew 26,000. And keep in mind, too, 1984 was a much bigger year for World Class than 85. But even by this point last year, things were relatively good in terms of tickets and gate numbers for live events. They hadn't run off all the fans in droves. By 1986, the attendance figure for the third annual Cotton Bowl event, 5,385. That is not an exaggeration. From 1985 to 1986, 1 year, they went from 26,000 to a little over 5,000 for drawing at the Cotton Bowl. If you do the math, that is a drop of approximately 81%. They drew around 19 to 20% of the audience that they drew just 1 year prior to the same event. That is a scary figure. And I know the weather was really bad for this event. Imagine the one time a year where it's actually cold in Texas. People that actually showed up for this thing were getting rained on during certain parts. That's your loyal, passionate fan base right there. The 5,000 people that came to see this thing live. Bad weather and all. But there were other mitigating factors that played a part in the bad attendance. The booking, quality of the programming, the star power, or lack thereof. Card itself wasn't anything to jump up and down about. I think the weather circumstances were just another piece to the puzzle. But we'll go ahead and get into this thing. Talk about what we did see. They obviously taped more than what they aired here in this hour-long show. Oh, spoiler too. In case you were wondering how they did when they ran the same event in 1987. 3,000. Let that sink in. So as we attempt to overlook a practically empty stadium, it's the equivalent to AEW Stadium Stampede, except their intention was to do a stupid gimmick match with an empty stadium. So the prelim opener this week is the Grappler versus Steve Casey. This is where Bill Mercer explained the cold front that came in from the north earlier that week. They'd apparently got some heavy rain just days prior to actually running the stadium show. So I guess it was a little bit of a blessing there. The fact that they didn't get completely rained out. Although looking at the ocean of empty seats, probably would have been better off. And just when you thought things couldn't get any more snake bit for this event, speaking of rain, as Casey and Grappler are out there doing spots together, Grappler gets Casey down in a chin lock, and approximately 5 seconds later, you just see everybody opposite the hard cam side throwing their rain jackets and umbrellas up in the air as a massive fucking downpour begins right in the middle of Grappler's heat spot. And when I say downpour, I literally mean the entire ring mat was soaked within a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, the Grappler's just holding Casey down in this stationary chinlock for a couple minutes. By God, that rain can come all at once. But I am not letting go of this fucking chinlock for anything. I personally think they took the match home early, because there wasn't even a comeback sequence when Casey just grabbed the Grappler and planted him with a bulldog. Probably a good call, because I don't think it would have been safe to continue doing spots on a slippery ring mat like that. Way too risky. So getting off to that lovely train wreck start, where the very first match on the card gets interrupted by a fucking tsunami. Well, we come back for a Dingo Warrior Steve Simpson interview in the locker room, just before they went out for their tag team title match with Sawyer and Bourne. We did at least get an idea of how Warrior and Simpson became tag team partners out of the blue. It was not a very descriptive explanation, but it was an explanation. And I'll accept that at this point. They talked about their preparation for this opportunity and how it's not just about titles, especially for the Dingo. It's about revenge. And he repeated that phrase a good 3 or 4 times within the span of about 30 seconds. Revenge. I'm gonna go out and get my revenge. That's what the Dingo Warrior's all about, is revenge. You know, as bad as the promo was, at least the Warrior sounded fired up and passionate. Simpson sounded like somebody held a gun to his back. He was saying everything like a hostage victim. And so we get the match. Buzz Sawyer and Matt Bourne versus Dingo Warrior and Steve Simpson for the World Tag Titles. And first things first, before we cover anything about the match, more completely unexpected random shit happening here in World Class in the fall of '86. Sunshine's back. Yup, just there she was. Completely unannounced. Randomly standing in the babyface's corner. I don't know why. I don't know how or when or where or anything of the such. They also taped this match way later in the show because it was almost pitch black as they were starting to ring the bell. Funny moment when Percy's at ringside asking, "I want to know what Sunshine's doing out there." Yeah, same here, Percy. We are just as confused as you are. So they had a fairly basic formula. They let Warrior run wild on the heels at the beginning and have him do a bunch of power moves. Eventually Simpson got in there so the heels could cut him off and work him over for a bit. There was a pretty significant jump cut in the editing during the heat. Not entirely sure how long the heat lasted for, but must have been a while. Because the match had already been going quite a bit of time. They did a false tag spot to Warrior at one point. Again, it's all very standard tag team wrestling. And you know, all things considered, the match was going along pretty smoothly. And then things got real shitty. It began with Warrior's comeback. He legitimately looked like he was dragging himself through quicksand. Could not believe how slowly he was moving. And if that wasn't bad enough, he goes to pick up Sawyer, and, well, because he's an idiot, he forgot about the over-the-top rope stipulation. So, for no reason at all, he chucks Sawyer out to the floor and gets the match thrown out for the babyfaces. And they didn't even try to play it up like, oh, Warrior was frustrated over everything that went down between him and the champions. No, Mercer just flat out said, I think the Dingo Warrior forgot about the over-the-top rope stipulation. So a way to make him look like a dope. And so after the babyfaces DQ themselves, champions run back in to try to get some heat back on themselves. But then Simpson and Warrior run them off almost immediately. I mean, up until the last minute, match wasn't horrible. All they had to do was keep the Warrior on the ring apron through most of it and let Sawyer and Bourne control the pace of everything. So that aspect was fine. I still would like to know what the detail is with Sunshine. Not that her being back is a negative thing, I'm just curious. A, where the fuck has she been for the last 5 months? And B, why is she now randomly in the corner of Warrior and Simpson? Perhaps we'll get an explanation, or maybe not. Maybe it'll be a Rick Rude situation where he just comes out with some random woman named Raven and we're all just supposed to look the other way and not ask questions. You know, at this point, it's easy enough for me to say I don't care, but I don't. And that took us to Kevin Von Erich versus Black Bart for the World Heavyweight title. The most predictable four-scene title change in the history of mankind. Again, we covered the deal with Black Bart becoming the world champion after they stripped Chris Adams of the belt. They needed a transitional champion so they could put the belt on a top babyface at the big show. It was probably in the works to be Kevin versus Chris at Texas Stadium before all the personal shit happened with Chris, and I'm not going to go into that diatribe again. So we got the theoretical next best option. And the action here was fine. I never had an issue with Black Bart as a worker, but at no point here did I ever think that he stood a chance of retaining the title against Kevin. At least not without some kind of fucked finish. They had Kerry out there watching at ringside, which everybody was happy to see. Still on crutches. He was a long way away from making his return to the ring. And you could tell that he knew that just by watching his facial expression. Now, to their credit, even though we knew Bart was dropping the strap here to Kevin, they did at least try to make a story out of him losing the title, which kind of saved it for being an outright burial. Not even a burial, just a lousy heel transitional champion. So Bart gives Kevin a leg drop over the middle rope. As then he goes for a cover. Kevin manages to slip his shoulder out at 2. But Bart thinks it's a 3 count. So as he and Rick Hazard are arguing back and forth, Kevin gives Bart a missile drop kick. Then he hits a big warrior splash on Bart to win the title and get the surprise upset. And you know, Bart did the thing where he immediately springs back up and acts all shocked that Kevin got the win. So it wasn't like they beat him flat where he had to lay there selling on his back for minutes on end. And it's obviously supposed to be this big hoorah moment. I mean, it's definitely a far cry from when Kevin won the world title at Texas Stadium in '84 against Flair. I mean, they're not even remotely comparable. I guess for Kevin, it's a different circumstance because he has gotten a couple title shots at the NWA world title, but he never actually won a major world singles title before this point. Unless you want to count the American heavyweight title, but who honestly even remembers when that was, considering how frequently that title changed hands. So this was a pretty big moment, especially for a stadium show. I think that's what made it particularly special. Still think it would have been a bigger deal had Kevin beaten Chris Adams instead of Black Bart. But the crowd went crazy for the outcome. By this stage, though, I mean, I hate to play devil's advocate, but did it really matter who the world champion was in World Class by this point? I mean, yeah, putting the top belt on Kevin was a safe haven. But did it really make a difference? Was it going to turn the product around and give the people a whole new sign of hope that the company would get out of the rut they've been in? I don't think so. I mean, the fans that came to see this event in person were pretty much the loyal core group of world-class fans that were going to come see the product regardless of how good or bad things were. And let's be honest, too. We don't like to mention this. It's not like the Von Erichs had a very good rapport with the fans at this point. A lot of them knew what was going on. They knew the boys were doing some shady, underhanded stuff. But the story of the show is the attendance numbers. It's not just what we're seeing at the Sportatorium. It's the live events and the house shows all around the Texas area. I mean, we're only just seeing how bad things are because the cameras are rolling. Sure, you can go back to the well with the Von Erich thing as much as you want. But eventually the people are going to come to see that the good Christian boys aren't exactly what the company insisted they were. They understood the meaning of try not to meet your heroes, because they usually end up disappointing you. Well, to echo the documentary, it's tragic. And that really is what world class has become here in 86. A shell of what the company used to be just 2 or 3 years beforehand. Can't stay on top forever, obviously. But the fall was a lot steeper than I think a lot of people are willing to admit. The triumph and the tragedy rolls on. And that'll wrap up everything here for the Friday show. And I will make sure that I remember to actually upload it on Friday, instead of forgetting like I did on Monday with the Retro Raw report. Eeps. So, thanks everybody for checking out the show. Again, make sure you subscribe, comment, and give the show a like. And we will reconvene on Monday for the WWF In Your House Buried Alive pay-per-view recap, and we'll also do Retro Raw. I gotta see if I can find time to fit in World Class as well. I don't know. 5 wrestling shows in 2 days is a lot to ask. I'll do my best, but I'm not making any promises. All that said, thanks everybody for watching, and take care. Peace out.